He reached for his wallet when the little girl stopped him and held out a broken doll, whispering, "It's all I have." He followed her into a dark alley expecting poverty, but what waited behind that door wasn't a child in need. It was the past he had abandoned, calling him back. Julian Cross sat alone at the corner table high above the city, surrounded by glass, steel, and silence. The restaurant was flawless, every surface polished, every sound measured, the kind of place where nothing was left to chance except meaning. In front of him, the plate looked like a work of art. Beef Wellington cooked to perfection, a dish that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. Beside it, a bottle of vintage red wine waited untouched, breathing quietly into empty space. Julian took a bite. He chewed. He felt nothing. At 41, Julian Cross had built an empire that shaped skylines and rewrote markets. His name appeared in business journals, his decisions echoed across continents. His phone vibrated softly, messages from executives, lawyers, analysts, numbers climbing, profits surging. On paper, he was winning. Inside, he was empty. The waiter approached, respectful, careful not to intrude. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Cross?" Julian glanced at the half-eaten plate. "Yes," he said flatly. "You can bring the check." The waiter hesitated, eyes flicking briefly to the untouched food, then nodded. Julian didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and simply no longer cared. He paid without looking at the total, left a generous tip out of habit, not kindness, stood, straightened his coat, and walked away. As he crossed the dining room, a few people recognized him. Subtle nods, polite smiles, respect without warmth. Outside, the winter air struck his face, sharp, cold, honest. Julian welcomed it. For a moment, standing beneath the starless sky, he felt something close to real. Then he started walking. Not toward his driver, not toward home, just forward. Julian hadn't gone far when something gently tugged at his coat. Not a shove, not desperation, just a quiet pull. He stopped and looked down. A little girl stood there, barely reaching his waist. Her dark curls were messy, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The oversized jacket she wore had once belonged to someone bigger, warmer, safer. In her arms, she held a cloth doll. The doll was old, handmade, faded from years of love. One arm hung loosely attached by only a few threads. The girl didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply lifted the doll toward him as if offering something precious. "Mister," she said softly. Her voice was calm, too calm for someone so small. "Would you buy her?" Julian blinked, confused. "For food," she added. "Please." He glanced around instinctively. The street was quiet. No adults nearby, no signs of supervision. "Where are your parents?" he asked, sharper than he meant to. The girl hugged the doll closer to her chest. "My mom went away," she said after a pause. "I live with my grandma." Julian's hand moved automatically toward his pocket. Money. That was how problems were solved. But before he could pull out his wallet, the girl shook her head. She pushed the doll closer instead. "It's my only toy," she said. "But we're hungry." Something in her posture, straight, steady, made Julian freeze. She wasn't asking for charity. She was offering a trade. The words lingered between them. "It's my only toy." Julian felt them settle somewhere deep, heavier than they should have been. He looked at the doll again. The uneven stitches, the fraying fabric, the careful repairs that spoke of hands doing their best with very little. "What's your name?" he asked, lowering himself to her level. "Elia," she replied. "And this is Moth." "Moth," Julian repeated quietly. "She's hurt," Elia explained, touching the loose arm gently. "But Grandma says broken things don't stop being important." Julian swallowed. "How old are you?" "6," she said, then added as if it mattered, "almost 7. Are you hungry, Elia?" She hesitated. Her eyes flicked away for a second, then back. "Yes." And your grandma? She's waiting for me, Elia said. She always waits. Julian checked his watch. Nearly 10. A child shouldn't know what waiting like that meant. Why are you out here alone? He asked softly. Elia tightened her grip on Moth. We didn't eat today, she said simply. Grandma gave me her part yesterday, so I came to look for something. The honesty hit harder than any accusation. Julian stood there surrounded by glass towers and glowing storefronts, suddenly aware of his coat, his watch, the invisible wall between their worlds. Do you like hamburgers? He asked. Elia's eyes brightened, then dimmed again. Yes, she said, but Grandma needs to eat too. Julian straightened. For the first time that night, he made a decision without checking his calendar. Come with me, he said gently. We'll eat. Both of you. Elia studied his face carefully. Then she held out her small hand. You promise, Julian took it. I promise. And with that, something long asleep inside him began to wake. They didn't walk side by side at first. Julian slowed his pace instinctively, but Elia lagged a step behind her small boots, scuffing lightly against the pavement. The city felt different now, quieter, less performative. Neon lights reflected on wet asphalt stretching into thin, trembling lines. Julian glanced down. Elia, he said gently, you don't have to stay behind. She looked up, surprised, then moved closer still, careful not to touch him again. Moth dangled from her arm, the loose limb swaying softly with each step. My grandma says grown-ups walk fast when they're busy, Elia explained. I didn't want to make you late. Julian stopped. Late. The word landed oddly. His entire life had been built around it being early, being on time, never missing a meeting. Yet right now, nothing had ever felt less urgent. I'm not busy, he said. Elia studied his face as if checking whether the sentence was real. Okay, she said at last, accepting it. They continued this time together. Julian took off his leather gloves and tucked them into his coat pocket. Without a word, he removed his scarf and wrapped it loosely around Elia's neck. She froze. It's too cold, he said simply. Elia touched the fabric, eyes widening. It's soft, she whispered, like when Grandma tells stories. Julian didn't answer. He was suddenly thinking about how much the scarf had cost and how meaningless that number felt now. Is it far? Elia asked. No, he said. Not far. They turned down a quieter street. The storefronts changed. Less glass, more brick. The glow softened, warmer, humbler. Elia, Julian said, What does your grandma like? She smiled faintly. Tea, she said, and fries. But she only eats the fries she makes herself. Julian nodded, committing the detail to memory. And you? She looked down at Moth. I like when people keep promises. Julian felt a tightening in his chest. He hadn't realized how rare promises had become in his world. The diner sat on the corner, glowing softly like a secret kept warm. No valet, no maitre d', just a flickering sign and steamed-up windows that hinted at heat food and safety. Elia stopped walking. This place, she asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice. Julian followed her gaze, the cracked tiles, the laminated menu taped near the door, a couple of mismatched chairs visible through the glass. Yes, he said. Is that okay? Elia nodded slowly. My grandma says places don't have to look nice to be kind. Julian held the door open. Warm air rushed out, carrying the scent of grilled meat and coffee. The noise inside was gentle clinking dishes, low conversation, a radio murmuring in the background. They stepped in together, heads turned. Julian felt it immediately, that familiar sense of not belonging. His coat, his posture, his face that people recognized, even here. But Elia didn't hesitate. Can we sit by the window? She asked, pointing. Of course. They slid into the booth. Elia placed Moth carefully beside her, propping the doll upright, as if she were part of the conversation. A waitress approached, curious but kind. "What can I get you?" Before Julian could speak, Elia answered, "A cheeseburger, with fries, please." The confidence in her voice startled him. "I'll have the same," Julian added. "And 2 more to go." The waitress nodded and walked away. Elia's hands rested on the table, now fingers barely touching the edge. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving me money," she replied. Julian blinked. "My grandma says money disappears," Elia explained, "but food stays longer, and promises stay the longest." Julian felt something shift. "What about Moth?" he asked, nodding at the doll. "She likes hamburgers too," Elia said seriously, "but she only eats when no one's watching." Julian smiled. It surprised him how natural it felt. "Who made her?" he asked. "My grandma," Elia said, "from my mom's old clothes, so I wouldn't forget." Julian didn't push further. When the food arrived, Elia waited. She didn't touch it. "Is something wrong?" Julian asked. She shook her head. "I just want to make sure you're really staying." Julian met her gaze. "I'm here," he said. Only then did she take her first bite. Elia ate slowly, deliberately, as if each bite mattered. Julian noticed it immediately. No rushing, no waste. She chewed carefully, savoring the warmth, the taste, the comfort. It was nothing like the mechanical way he had eaten for years, half-focused, already thinking about what came next. "This is really good," Elia said between bites. "My grandma makes burgers too, but not like this." "What does she make best?" Julian asked. "Soup," Elia replied. "When people are sad." Julian nodded, unsure why the answer tightened his throat. He took a bite of his own burger. It was simple, ordinary, and yet for the first time in a long while he felt truly hungry and satisfied. "You live just with your grandma?" he asked gently. Elia nodded. "My mom went to the sky," she said. "Grandma says she's somewhere warm, and your dad—" Elia shrugged. "I don't have one." Julian didn't ask more. Elia reached for a fry and placed it carefully on Moth's lap. "For later," she explained. Julian watched her hands, small, precise, already carrying responsibility far beyond her years. "Do you go to school?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, "when Grandma can afford the bus." Julian felt the word afford echo. The waitress returned with the bags to go. Elia held one like it contained something fragile. "This is for Grandma," she said firmly. "She'll be happy." Julian paid the bill, leaving a tip that made the waitress pause. "Thank you," the woman said quietly. Not for the money, but for the way he looked at the child beside him. Outside, the cold returned. Elia shivered. Julian removed his scarf again, adjusting it around her neck more securely this time. "It's like a cloud," she said, smiling. "Where do you live?" Julian asked. Elia pointed toward a darker stretch of the street. "Over there," she said, "past the nice lights." Julian followed her gaze. The city thinned. Brightness gave way to shadow. And as they started walking, Julian felt it clearly now. They weren't just going somewhere. They were crossing into a world he had never truly seen. The city changed without asking permission. Julian noticed it not by what appeared, but by what disappeared. Storefronts grew fewer. Windows dimmed. The polished sidewalks cracked into uneven slabs. Streetlights stood farther apart, casting long shadows that swallowed entire doorways. Elia walked with confidence. Not bravado, familiarity. "This way," she said, turning left without slowing down. Julian followed his footsteps, suddenly loud in the quiet. People passed them, an older man carrying groceries, a woman pulling a cart, 2 teenagers laughing softly. No one stared. No one questioned why a well-dressed man walked beside a small girl with a broken doll. This was Elia's world. She belonged here. Julian realized how rarely he belonged anywhere. "My grandma says this street used to be brighter," Elia said as if reading his thoughts. "Before the store closed." "What store?" Julian asked. The one that sold warm bread, she replied. They closed when the rent went up. Julian nodded, his jaw tightening. They passed a narrow alley. Elia slowed. Not here, she said quickly. That's not ours. She pointed farther ahead to where the street bent slightly and the light dimmed again. There. Julian followed her finger. At the end of the bend, a darker path opened an alley narrower than the rest, tucked away, as if deliberately forgotten. Elia, Julian asked gently, Are you sure it's okay to go this way? She looked at him, surprised. It's home, she said simply. They turned. The sounds of the city softened. Traffic faded. Voices disappeared. Julian felt something unfamiliar, not fear, but awareness. A sharpened sense that he was stepping beyond statistics, beyond reports and headlines. Elia, he said, Does your grandma know you met me? She shook her head. She'll know I ate, Elia said. She always knows. The alley narrowed. The buildings leaned inward, brick worn smooth by time and weather. A single light flickered halfway down. Julian adjusted his pace again unconsciously, positioning himself slightly closer to Elia. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did and trusted him anyway. They stopped in front of the last structure in the alley. It wasn't really a house. More like something assembled from necessity and patience. Unfinished concrete walls. A wooden door worn pale by years of use. A small window covered by a thin curtain glowing faintly from within. This is it, Elia said, her voice softer now. Julian took it in slowly. The place was small but tidy. Clean. Loved. Grandma must be worried, Elia murmured, glancing up at the window. She waits. Julian felt a sudden weight in his chest. Before he could speak, the door opened. A woman stood there, late 60s, maybe older. Her hair was silver, pulled back neatly. Her posture was careful, as if each movement required thought. Her eyes, however, were sharp and alert, filled with relief the moment they landed on Elia. There you are, my angel, she said, voice warm but firm. I told you not to. Her words stopped. Her gaze shifted, from Elia to Julian. Time seemed to pause. The woman's expression changed, not to fear, not to anger, but to something deeper. Shock, recognition, disbelief. Elia, she said quietly, without taking her eyes off Julian. Who is this? Elia beamed. This is Mr. Julian, she announced proudly. He bought moth and food. We ate, and he brought dinner for you. She lifted the bag like a prize. The woman's hands trembled slightly. Julian felt it, an inexplicable pull, a familiarity that made no sense. I'm sorry, he said instinctively. I didn't mean to intrude. She was hungry. The woman swallowed. Her eyes searched his face, slowly, carefully, as if confirming something she was afraid to name. You came back, she said, not accusing, not grateful, just stunned. Julian frowned. Yes, he said. I promised. The woman's breath caught. Elia, she said gently. Go inside, sweetheart. Put the food on the table. Elia hesitated, sensing the shift. Are you okay, Grandma? She asked. Yes, the woman replied, forcing a smile. I just need a moment. Elia nodded and slipped past them. The door remained open. Warm light spilled into the alley. And suddenly, the woman whispered a name Julian hadn't heard spoken aloud in decades. Julian. The sound of his name struck him like a held breath finally released. No one used it like that anymore. Not softly. Not with memory attached. He looked at her fully now. The lines on her face. The familiar steadiness in her eyes. The faint scar near her lip that tugged at something buried deep in his mind. I'm sorry, he said automatically. Have we met? The woman laughed quietly. Not from humor, from disbelief. Oh, she whispered. You don't remember. Julian's pulse quickened. I should, he asked. She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Come in, she said. It's cold out here. Julian hesitated. The alley felt suddenly too narrow, too heavy with unspoken history. Inside, the space was small but orderly. A couch with a neatly folded blanket, a table set for two. Children's drawings taped carefully to the wall. Elia stood by the table arranging the food with precision. "Moth sits here," she announced, placing the doll gently beside a chair. The woman watched, her eyes softening, then turned back to Julian. "You were just about her age," she said quietly. Julian froze. "When I used to walk you home," she continued. "When your father worked late, a memory flickered, a warm kitchen, a voice telling stories, hands fixing torn toys." "No," Julian whispered. "That's not possible." She met his gaze. "My name is Margaret Hale," she said. The room tilted. The name unlocked something long sealed away. Margaret. The woman his father had dismissed without explanation. The woman whose letters never reached him. The woman who had once been his safe place. Julian swallowed hard. "Elia," Margaret said gently, sensing the storm. "Why don't you go wash your hands, sweetheart?" Elia nodded, obedient but curious. When she disappeared behind the curtain, silence fell. Margaret looked at Julian, really looked at him. "You grew up," she said softly. Julian's voice broke. "So did you." And in that small room, surrounded by drawings and dim light, the past began to surface quietly, painfully, and with consequences neither of them had planned. The room felt smaller once the door closed, not physically, emotionally. Julian stood near the entrance, unsure where to put his hands, his eyes drawn to the details he hadn't noticed at first. The drawings on the wall, crayons worn down to stubs. A chipped mug sitting beside the sink, washed carefully and set to dry. Margaret moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step carried memory. "Elia," she called softly. "Did you wash your hands?" "Yes." "Grandma," came the reply from behind the curtain. Margaret nodded, then turned back to Julian. "You always stood like that," she said suddenly, "near the door, as if you weren't sure you were allowed to stay." Julian felt a quiet shock ripple through him. "I don't remember much from that time," he said. Margaret smiled, not sadly, not bitterly, just knowingly. "Children remember how they feel," she said, "even when the details fade." She gestured toward the small table. "Sit," she added gently. "You look like you might fall otherwise." Julian obeyed. The chair creaked beneath his weight. He felt enormous in the space, oversized in his tailored coat. "You used to ask me why your father never came to say goodnight." Margaret continued, her voice calm. "You didn't cry. You just wondered." Julian stared at the tabletop. "I was fired the day after I told him you cried in your sleep," she said. Julian's head snapped up. "What he said, emotions made boys weak," Margaret said quietly. "He told me not to fill your head with softness." The words landed hard, but not violently, like truth always does. "I wrote to you," she added, "for years." Julian's throat tightened. "I never got them," "I know," Margaret said. "I stopped when I realized they weren't reaching you." Silence stretched between them. From behind the curtain, Elia hummed softly, safe, unaware. Julian closed his eyes. For the first time, the emptiness in his chest had a shape. Elia emerged with clean hands and bright eyes. "Can Grandma eat now?" she asked, hopeful. Margaret nodded, smoothing Elia's hair. "Yes, sweetheart." They sat together at the table, three people who had never planned to share a meal, bound now by something older than intention. Elia placed the food carefully in front of Margaret. "I saved the fries," she announced proudly. Margaret smiled and took a slow bite, chewing as if the taste needed time. Julian watched. Noticed how she ate carefully, conservatively, as though meals were never guaranteed. "You don't have to save for later," Julian said softly. Margaret met his gaze. "Old habits," she replied. "They don't disappear just because things improve." Elia swung her legs gently. "Mr. Julian promised," she said. He came back. Margaret inhaled sharply, then steadied herself. "You kept your word," she said to Julian. "I had to," he replied. I don't think I could have lived with myself otherwise. Margaret nodded. Elia's mother said the same thing once, she said quietly. Julian stiffened. Elia's mom, Linda Margaret, said, "My daughter." Elia looked up, curious but calm. "She went to the warm place," Elia said. "With the sky." "Yes," Margaret said gently. "She did." Margaret's hands folded together. "Linda worked too hard," she continued. "She was determined not to repeat my life. But sometimes determination costs more than people can afford." Julian listened. Really listened. "She got sick," Margaret said, "and waited too long to rest." The silence that followed was heavy but not cruel. Julian nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing it wasn't enough. Margaret looked at him. "We survived," she said simply. "That's what matters." Elia leaned against her grandmother. "Moth survived too," she added helpfully. Margaret smiled. "Yes," she said. "She did." Julian felt it then, the realization settling in. This wasn't a story of tragedy. It was a story of endurance. Julian stood to leave, or at least he thought he did. His body moved, but his feet didn't. Outside the alley was quiet. Inside the small room glowed with warmth. Margaret noticed. "You don't have to stay," she said kindly. "You've already done more than I don't want to go," Julian interrupted. The words surprised them both. Margaret searched his face. "You used to say that too," she said softly. "When your father called." Julian exhaled. "I didn't know what staying meant back then," he said. "I think I'm starting to." Elia yawned, rubbing her eyes. Margaret stood carefully. "Come," she said. "It's late for her." Julian watched as Margaret tucked Elia in behind the curtain, smoothing the blanket, placing Moth beside her with care. "Good night," Julian said quietly. Elia smiled sleepily. "Thank you for seeing me," she murmured. The words struck deeper than any accusation. Margaret returned and sat across from him. "You don't owe us anything," she said. Julian shook his head. "I know," he replied. "That's why this matters." Outside, Julian's phone vibrated. Missed calls, messages. For the first time in years, he didn't look. "I'll come back," he said. Margaret nodded, not surprised. "I know," she said. Julian stepped into the cold night. But something was different now. He wasn't leaving a place. He was leaving people. And that made all the difference. The next 3 days moved forward, but Julian Cross did not. His body followed routines with mechanical obedience, while his mind remained trapped in a narrow alley lit by a single flickering bulb. Meetings blurred into one another. Voices spoke, numbers changed, decisions were made, yet none of it touched him. He sat at long tables of polished wood surrounded by people who waited for his approval, and all he could see were Elia's small hands, placing fries carefully beside a broken doll. At night, sleep refused to settle. When it came, it brought him backward to a smaller version of himself, standing by a doorframe, waiting for someone to notice he was still there. He woke before dawn, each time chest tight, the memory of Margaret's voice echoing in his head. "You always stood near the door." On the third morning, Julian stared out the window of his penthouse city spread beneath him, like a map stripped of meaning. He hadn't checked his phone since leaving the alley. Missed calls stacked quietly, respectful in their persistence. He realized something unsettling. The silence didn't feel like neglect. It felt like relief. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, less sharp, less armored. He remembered the way Margaret had eaten slowly, cautiously, as if the future were never guaranteed. He remembered Elia's certainty when she said promises lasted longer than money. Something in him shifted from guilt to clarity. This wasn't about fixing a problem. It was about acknowledging a truth he could no longer unsee. Julian canceled his day. No rescheduling. No explanations beyond a brief message to his assistant. He dressed without ceremony, dark jeans, a simple coat, and left the building without waiting for the driver. At a neighborhood grocery store far from his usual routes, He pushed a cart down narrow aisles, reading labels, noticing prices, watching people calculate. He filled the cart deliberately, rice, pasta, beans, soup, ingredients, bread, milk, fruit. He paused, then added tea and potatoes. At the checkout, he didn't rush. He didn't avoid eye contact. When he left, the bags were heavier than he expected. He welcomed the weight. It felt honest. As he walked toward the alley, daylight revealed details the night had hidden: potted plants on windowsills, a broom propped carefully against a wall, a child's chalk drawing fading on concrete. He slowed, heart pounding, uncertain, in a way no negotiation had ever made him feel. The door at the end of the alley was closed. Julian stood there, bags biting into his hands, and for a moment he wondered if he deserved to knock. Then he did. Light footsteps approached. The door opened. Aaliyah's face lit up like a sunrise. "You came back," she said, not surprised, not relieved, certain. Julian nodded, words caught somewhere deeper than speech. Inside, Margaret watched from the table, eyes steady, dignity intact. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. Julian set the bags down slowly, careful not to tear the paper. Aaliyah hovered nearby, curiosity bright, but restrained, as if she understood that some moments needed patience. Margaret nodded once, acknowledging his presence without rushing to gratitude. "Come in," she said. "You must be tired." It wasn't a question. The room felt different in daylight, smaller, yes, but warmer, more intentional. Julian noticed how every object had a place, how nothing was wasted. Aaliyah began unpacking with reverence, lifting items as if they were gifts rather than necessities. "Potatoes," she announced happily. "Grandma, now you can make fries." Margaret smiled, a quiet curve that held both pride and restraint. "You didn't have to do this," Margaret said, not unkindly. Julian shook his head. "I wanted to." The simplicity of the sentence surprised him. He meant it. As Aaliyah arranged items in the cupboard, Julian noticed how little space there was, how careful Margaret was with each placement. He remembered his own kitchens, vast, immaculate, unused. The contrast didn't shame him anymore. It instructed him. Aaliyah disappeared briefly and returned with Moth, placing the doll on the table like a guest. "She needs fixing," Aaliyah said, matter of fact. "But Grandma's hands hurt." Julian nodded. He pulled a small sewing kit from one of the bags. Margaret looked at it, then at him. "Thank you," she said, and the word carried weight without debt. Aaliyah's eyes widened. "Can you teach me," she asked her grandmother, "so I can help?" Margaret considered this, then nodded. "Slowly," she said. "Carefully." Aaliyah beamed. They ate together, a simple meal that felt earned. Conversation moved gently without probing. Julian listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was to ask small questions that mattered: what Aaliyah liked to draw, which soup Margaret preferred, how the winter had been. Outside, the city continued as it always had, indifferent. Inside, something steadier took shape. When Julian stood to leave, Aaliyah tilted her head. "You'll come again," she said, not asking. Julian felt the old reflex, the urge to qualify, to hedge, to promise in terms that allowed escape. He didn't. "Yes," he said, "I will." Aaliyah nodded, satisfied, and returned to her drawing. Margaret walked him to the door. "You don't owe us a future," she said quietly. Julian met her gaze. "I know," he replied. "I'm choosing one." Outside, the air was crisp. Julian walked away with a strange calm, knowing that return was no longer a question of intention, but of truth. He wasn't fixing anything. He was learning where he belonged when the lights faded. The routine formed without announcement. Julian came back the next day and the day after that, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but time. He learned the rhythms of the alley, the hours when it filled with sound, the moments when it grew quiet enough to hear footsteps echo. He learned Aaliyah's patience, how she waited before speaking, how she listened as if the world mattered. He learned Margaret's strength, the kind that didn't perform, that simply endured with grace. None of it felt like charity. It felt like recognition. One afternoon, Julian arrived carrying a small wrapped package. Elia eyed it with curiosity but waited, hands folded. "It's for you," Julian said. She opened it carefully, revealing a cloth doll, simple, handmade, gentle. Elia studied it, then hugged it briefly before setting it beside Moth. She can be Moth's sister, Elia decided. So Moth isn't alone. Julian watched as she adjusted the two dolls, ensuring both were included. The lesson landed without words, nothing needed replacing to be valued. That evening, as Elia slept behind the curtain, Julian and Margaret sat with tea. The city hummed beyond the walls. "I've been thinking," Julian said, "about staying." Margaret didn't interrupt, not like before. He continued, "Not visiting, being present." She considered this, eyes steady. "Staying is not a favor," she said. "It's a responsibility." Julian nodded. "I understand." For the first time, he meant it without fear. The decision arrived quietly. Julian would not return to his life unchanged. He would not compartmentalize this place into something he visited and then forgot. He began arranging care for Margaret's knee. He found a modest house not far from the alley, light, safe, close enough to keep roots intact. He didn't present it as rescue. He offered it as continuity. Margaret accepted after a long pause, dignity intact. Elia accepted immediately, joy unguarded. On the day they moved, there was little to carry. Drawings, clothes, two dolls. Julian felt the weight of it all more than any acquisition he had ever made. When they stood in the new living room, sunlight spilling across the floor, Elia ran from room to room, laughter echoing. Margaret touched the wall with her palm as if asking permission to believe. Julian watched them and understood finally what his life had been preparing him for. Not success. Presence. Later, when Elia asked the question she had been holding, "Are you going to leave?" Julian knelt to her level and answered, without rehearsed courage. "No," he said. "I'm staying." The certainty in his voice surprised him. Elia nodded, satisfied, and went back to arranging her dolls. Margaret exhaled a long breath, released. That night, Julian slept without waking. And in the quiet, something fundamental settled into place. Family wasn't who arrived with answers. It was who stayed when the questions finally mattered. The house did not feel like a miracle. It felt like an answer that had taken too long to arrive. Morning light entered gently through wide windows, touching the floor before it touched the walls, as if announcing itself politely. Elia woke early and explored quietly, opening doors with care, stepping lightly as though the space itself might be fragile. She placed Moth and her sister doll side by side on the small desk by the window, adjusting them so both could see the sky. Julian watched from the doorway, realizing how instinctively she made room for everyone. Nothing was pushed aside. Nothing was replaced. Everything was included. Margaret moved more slowly than before, her knee still reminding her of years that had asked too much. Yet there was a change in her posture, subtle but undeniable. She stood straighter. She paused less often to brace herself against furniture. When she brewed tea, the kettle whistled and she smiled at the sound as if it were permission to enjoy a simple pleasure without calculation. Julian noticed these things and said nothing. He had learned that care did not need commentary. They began to build routines. Breakfasts that were unhurried. Afternoons where Elia drew at the table while Julian answered emails he no longer allowed to run his life. Margaret took short walks in the yard, testing the ground, trusting it to hold her. Neighbors passed by and waved. No one asked questions that needed answers. The house learned their names by listening. Julian scheduled the appointments quietly. A doctor who spoke clearly and waited patiently. A plan that respected Margaret's dignity. When she protested, Julian listened. When she agreed, it was because she chose to. Elia sat nearby during these conversations, attentive, absorbing the language of consent, and care. She learned that help did not have to feel like surrender. One afternoon, Julian returned with a set of colored pencils. Elia held the box as if it contained something alive. She opened it, slowly gasping at the range of colors. "All of them," she said, awed. "Even the ones you can't name." She drew the house first, then the yard, then 3 figures holding hands without labels. Julian recognized himself only by the posture, bent slightly, listening. At dinner, Elia asked a question without looking up. "Do houses know when people are scared?" Margaret paused. Julian waited. "I think houses learn," Margaret said finally. "They learn how to hold people." Elia nodded, satisfied. She fed Moth an imaginary spoonful and placed her back beside her sister. The lesson repeated itself without instruction. That night, Julian sat alone on the porch, the city distant and kind. He thought of the life he had left, paused, not abandoned. He understood now that presence was not an emotion, but a practice. Inside the house settled around its new inhabitants, not as a shelter borrowed from fortune, but as a place that had begun to belong. Staying demanded more than time. It demanded attention. Julian learned this quickly. There were moments when he wanted to fix things efficiently, to move faster than the pace of healing allowed. Margaret noticed and corrected him gently. "We don't rush what needs care," she said once, setting a cup down carefully. Julian nodded and slowed. Elia watched this exchange with interest, filing it away. They explored the neighborhood together, not as visitors, but as participants. Elia led the way, introducing places with names she had given them long ago. The tree that kept secrets, the wall that changed colors with the sun, the corner where bread smelled like comfort. Julian followed, learning to see what he had once walked past. People greeted Elia by name. They nodded at Julian, curious but accepting. No one asked why he was there. He understood then that belonging was granted by consistency, not explanation. Margaret began to teach Elia to sew in the afternoons. The first lesson was patience. The second was acceptance. The stitches were uneven, visible, honest. When Elia pricked her finger, she didn't cry. She breathed. "It's okay," Margaret said. "It means you're learning." Julian watched, moved by the quiet competence of it all. When Elia finished repairing Moth's arm with red thread, she held the doll up proudly. "She's stronger here," she declared. Julian nodded, understanding the metaphor without needing to speak. There were difficult conversations, too. Julian spoke of his father without bitterness, only clarity. Margaret listened without defending or accusing. Elia absorbed the shapes of these truths, learning that adults could speak gently about hard things. Trust grew, not because pain disappeared, but because it was handled with care. One evening, as they shared soup, Elia asked, "Are we a family?" The question landed softly and stayed. Margaret looked at Julian. Julian looked at Elia. "Family is who stays," Margaret said, repeating the phrase Elia had taught them without knowing it. Julian added, "And who listens?" Elia smiled, satisfied, and returned to her soup. Julian began to shift his work. Meetings shortened, responsibilities redistributed. He chose mornings at the house and afternoons at the office. The balance surprised everyone, including himself. He felt lighter, not because his life was simpler, but because it was aligned. He slept better. He noticed the weather. He learned names. Staying, he discovered, was not passive. It was an active commitment to be changed. The house responded to this commitment by becoming more than walls. It became a witness. And Julian, who had built so much without roots, began to understand what it meant to grow. The idea did not arrive as a grand announcement. It formed slowly, shaped by afternoons at the table and conversations that returned to the same truth many families lived as Margaret and Elia had lived, quietly, with dignity unseen. Julian listened. He learned. He asked questions and waited for answers. The concept of a foundation emerged not as charity, but as continuity. A place that did not rescue, but supported. A place that did not judge, but welcomed. Julian shared the idea with Margaret first. She considered it carefully. If it's built without listening, she said it will fail. Julian agreed. He asked her to help shape it, not as a symbol, but as a guide. Margaret hesitated, then accepted with conditions: dignity, privacy, patience. Julian accepted all of them. Elia insisted on being involved. She drew pictures of rooms filled with color and people holding hands. Sad places need color, she explained. Julian took notes. Architects listened. The plans changed. Windows grew larger, spaces opened. The building chosen was modest and central, close to the neighborhood that had taught Julian how to see. The day they opened the doors, there were no speeches, just open rooms and waiting chairs. Families arrived slowly, cautiously. Margaret greeted them first. She listened. Julian watched trust form in real time, fragile and real. Elia guided children to a corner with cushions and crayons, explaining the rules she had made herself. Everyone shares, no one is left out. Julian felt something settle inside him. This was not legacy, as he had been taught to understand it. This was stewardship, presence scaled with care. That evening back at the house, Elia asked if the foundation had a name. Julian hadn't decided. Margaret smiled. Living roots, she said. Because roots live. They hold. Elia nodded vigorously. And they don't move away, she added. Julian laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar and welcome. As night fell, Julian sat on the porch again, listening to the quiet. He thought of the man he had been, the one who measured worth in numbers and distance. He thought of the child he had been waiting by doors. The circle closed without spectacle. Inside, Margaret read. Elia slept with 2 dolls beside her, red stitches visible and proud. Staying had changed everything, not by force, by care. And in that care, Julian found what he had never known: he was missing, roots that held, and a future that did not require him to leave himself behind. The morning the doors officially opened, the city looked ordinary. No banners stretched across the street, no cameras waited at the curb. The building stood quietly, renovated, but modest sunlight finding its way through wide windows as if it had always belonged there. Julian arrived early, not to prepare a speech, but to move chairs. He aligned them in small circles instead of rows, leaving space between people who might not yet know how close they could sit. Margaret arrived next, carrying nothing but herself. She paused at the threshold, hand resting briefly on the doorframe. The moment was not triumphant. It was careful. She stepped inside with the same dignity she had carried through every difficult year. Julian noticed how her presence changed the room. Conversations softened before they began. People slowed. Elia burst in, last, bright yellow jacket, unzipped backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Inside it, Moth and her sister sat side by side, peeking out as if curious about the world they were entering. Elia took her role seriously. She walked the space, checking corners, adjusting crayons, making sure cushions were evenly spread. This is where kids wait, she explained to no one in particular. Waiting is easier when you can draw. Families arrived gradually, grandparents holding hands too tightly, parents who spoke quietly, children who hovered near walls before finding courage. No one was rushed. No one was questioned. Margaret greeted each person with a nod and an invitation to sit. She listened first. Julian watched the room fill, not with noise, but with permission. A grandmother with tired eyes spoke of nights without sleep. A young mother asked if there were rules she might break without knowing. Margaret answered without authority, only experience. We start by listening, she said. The room exhaled. Julian moved among them, not as a benefactor, but as a caretaker of space. When someone asked what this place was, he answered simply, "It's somewhere you don't have to explain yourself." In the corner, Elia showed a group of children how to share colors. "You can use the bright ones first," she said. "They don't run out." By afternoon, laughter appeared, not loud, but real. Julian felt it then unmistakably. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning that had learned patience. That evening, they returned home tired in the best way. Elia kicked off her shoes and curled up on the couch, with her dolls recounting the day in fragments, who smiled, who shared, who learned a new color. Margaret brewed tea, moving carefully, the familiar ritual grounding the quiet. Julian watched them both and felt a sense of rightness that no success had ever provided. Later, Elia asked the question she asked whenever the day mattered. "Will we do it again tomorrow?" Julian smiled. "Yes," he said. "And the day after?" She nodded, satisfied, and drifted to sleep. Moth-tucked close red stitches visible and strong. On the porch, Julian and Margaret sat with their tea. The street was calm. "You didn't try to save anyone today," Margaret said. Julian considered this. "I didn't want to," he replied. "I wanted to stay." She nodded. "That's the difference." Julian thought of his old life, the speed, the distance, the certainty that he could leave and nothing would ask him to return. He thought of the child he had been standing near doors, learning early how to wait. He realized then that the ache he'd carried wasn't ambition unmet. It was connection delayed. Inside, Elia stirred and murmured something unintelligible. Margaret smiled. "She dreams out loud," she said. Julian laughed softly. The sound felt earned. Weeks passed, then months. The foundation grew carefully shaped by listening rather than expansion. Julian changed his work, stepping back without disappearing. He chose presence over position, clarity over control. People noticed not the sacrifice, but the steadiness. One afternoon, Elia brought home a sign she'd helped paint with the older kids. The letters were uneven, bright, impossible to miss. "Family is who stays." They hung it where sunlight would find it every morning. Julian stood beneath it and felt the truth of the words settle permanently. Family wasn't a title or a promise made once. It was a choice repeated. To show up, to listen, to remain. That night, as the house quieted, Julian understood something essential. He hadn't rescued a family. He had joined one. And in doing so, he had finally arrived somewhere he could stay. A year later, the house held seasons without strain. Morning light returned reliably. Evenings softened. Elia grew taller, her drawings more detailed, her questions more precise. Margaret moved with greater ease, her laughter coming quicker now unguarded. Julian learned to measure time differently, by dinners shared, by conversations finished without interruption, by the quiet confidence of continuity. On the anniversary of the night they met, they baked together. Elia stirred carefully, tongue pressed in concentration. Margaret supervised, smiling at the familiar chaos. Julian sliced fruit and listened to the radio hum. The cake wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. Afterward, they walked to the foundation together. It was closed for the day, but the garden was alive. Children's drawings adorned the fence. Herbs grew where there had once been rubble. Elia watered plants with seriousness, explaining which ones needed patience. Julian listened. At the gate, a new plaque had been installed, simple, understated. Living Roots Foundation. Beneath it, a smaller line read, "A place to be seen." Elia read it aloud and looked up at Julian. "That's you," she said matter-of-factly. Julian felt the words land not as praise but as recognition. For the first time in his life, he didn't deflect it. Back home, as dusk settled, Julian sat on the porch again. He thought of the night that had changed everything, a tug on his coat, a broken doll, a truth offered without fear. He smiled at the simplicity of it all. Inside, Elia fell asleep, mid-sentence, dolls tucked close. Margaret placed a blanket over her with practiced care. Julian watched, heart full and steady. He understood now the wealth he had built had never been the point. The life he had chosen was. He had learned to see, really see, and in doing so, he had been seen in return. The city continued beyond their quiet street, bright and indifferent. Julian didn't resent it anymore. He had found what mattered, not by reaching higher, but by staying close. And in that staying, he finally became the man he was meant to be. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.